Recording. And Bill and Ned, take it away.
All righty. Well, thank you for inviting us, Joel. It's nice to be with you. So first, I'll tell you, I was just talking to the mother the other day of a kid who apparently when she was 7, we came home really frustrated and said, "Honey, what's wrong?" And she said, "Well, the teacher asked today, what's the biggest number in the world? And I guessed 23,000. And the teacher said, what about 23,001? And the kid said, I was so close." Anyway, so Ned and I collaborated on The Self-Driven Child, came out in 2018. And as you know, the thesis, and part of the reason that we really have so much respect for what you folks do, is the main thesis of The Self-Driven Child is that having a sense of control over your own life is one of the most important things that we can help kids develop. And we focused on self-control in part because of the huge relationship between sense of control or autonomy and mental health. I mean, think about it. If you're anxious, your thinking is out of control. If you're depressed, you have no sense of control at all. And the research suggests that the people who study a sense of control, is to say that a healthy sense of control inoculates you from the harmful effects of stress. And what happens is when kids actually, they deal with stressful situations on their own with support if necessary, the prefrontal cortex activates. And when you're in a stressful situation, if your prefrontal cortex activates to go into coping mode, to figure out what to do, it dampens down the stress response, and it's not, you aren't stressed. You kind of stay in coping mode. And that's one of the goals is to help kids have enough experience dealing with stressful situations on their own, that they train their brain basically to go into coping mode as opposed to avoiding or freaking out. Huge relationship with mental health. And also, every place that Ned and I look to try to understand how do kids develop that kind of self-drive, that's internal motivation, intrinsic motivation, how do they develop it? And every place we looked, all the arrows pointed towards autonomy. That our go-to kind of thinking about motivation is self-determination theory, which holds that in order to be intrinsically motivated, you have to have 3 needs fulfilled: for a sense of relatedness, a sense of competence, and a sense of autonomy. And Ned and I, while we were working on The Self-Driven Child, we spoke to one of the 2 guys who developed self-determination theories 30-some years ago, and said our sense is if you had to lean on one of these 3, you'll lean on autonomy. And he said, that's absolutely right. That's the key. And there's just hundreds of studies now on the benefits kids get when we support in schools or at home, when we support that sense of autonomy. This is your life. So from both a mental health point of view and a motivational point of view, the sense of control seemed to be really a big deal. And as it just turns out, it's good for everything. It's good for physical health, for mental health. It's good for longevity, good for success in the job. It's a really big deal. And so our literary agent, about a year after The Self-Driven Child came out, said, it's time for us to think about a second book. And what I'd love, he said, people love the dialogue where you talk about how you talk with kids. And parents are desperate to kind of say, know more about how to talk to kids. Write a book about that. And Ned and I figured, well, between the 2 of us, we've been talking one-on-one with kids for probably 65 or 70 years. And we still see so many parents who say, I've told them a million times, or I keep trying to get them to see, or, I've taken away everything. I just don't know what else to do. And we thought, well, we can improve on this. And so we decided to write this book about communication. And we thought, we started with autonomy in The Self-Driven Child. We need to take a step back if we're writing about communicating with kids, because ultimately the purpose of communication is connection and relationship. And so we start the book with a chapter on developing a close relationship with parents, in part because having a close relationship with your parent is about as protective as you can get for against mental health problems. And it's a very big deal. And so we thought, let's focus there. And we did a focus group. We had several focus groups of older children and teenagers while we were working on the book. And one of the questions we asked the kids was, who do you feel closest to in this world? And a lot of times it was a parent, but as often it was a teacher or a coach or a counselor or an uncle or an older cousin, and somebody they could go to. I said, we asked, what is it about these people that makes you feel close to them? And invariably, kids would say something on the order of, they listen to me without judging, and they don't tell me what to do. They respect autonomy, and they don't judge me. And we know from a lot of research that the key to developing closeness is empathy and validation. So we start the book with a chapter on empathy and validation, and how we communicate these things to kids, and how powerful it can be. And Dad, why don't you take over, buddy, and talk a little bit about
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to build on that point about they don't tell us they don't judge me. What so often parents fall into the trap of is trying to jump to how to solve the problem. Well, did you do this? Did you try that? You should have done this, which feels, like you're being judged. Like, if only you hadn't done this, you fool, you wouldn't be in this pickle, kind of thing. And helping kids solve the problems that they're in is part of our role as parents, but it's just not the first step. We want to lead with empathy and validation, in part because, as Bill points out, is feeling understood that calms hard emotions, that makes closeness, as opposed to logic. And when we can use these tools of empathy and validation to calm kids' hard feelings, we can bring the prefrontal cortex back online and often put them in the position where they can solve things for themselves. So, I mean, if a kid comes home and is just fit to be taught, I was trying to tell a joke to Susie, and she got all mad. She told everyone that I was making fun of her. Now everybody hates me. Wow, and you're thinking, your kid only has this one friend. You think, well, what did you say to her, right? Or did you apologize? And you immediately start jumping there. That doesn't sound like Susie at all. She wouldn't do that. All of which is probably true, but not so validating. And what you can say instead is, my gosh, I'd be upset too if I felt like I tried to tell a joke and it went really badly. Note, I didn't say it was a joke or you did it well. I'm not necessarily agreeing with the facts, but simply that you would have a reason to feel the way that you do. And this tool it doesn't come naturally to everyone. One kind of iteration of it that we like a lot is, in psychology, one of the most foundational tools to help kind of create this sense of, I'm working hard to understand your perspective, is reflective listening. There's a terrific guy named Ron McGinn who has kind of a modern iteration of it, what he calls wigging. And wigging is what I got is. And you simply repeat back to people as closely as you can, if not verbatim, what you think you heard. One, as parents, as anyone doing this, it buys us time to figure out what the next thing is to say, so we don't just kind of blurt something out. But it's also a really powerful tool to make kids feel heard and feel like you're working hard to understand them. There's a fun story, we think a fun story in the book. Bill and I were out in Palo Alto giving a talk about the self-driven child, and the organizer of that sent us the next day an email that she'd received from a parent who'd attended the talk and had come home. Mom had come home to find her 7th grader just fit to be tied and was really spun up. And, Mom, I'm the weakest boy in all of 7th grade. And she's just like, wow, like, what do I do with that, right? And normally I would have just reflexively said, oh, sweetheart, it's not that big a deal. I mean, you have so many other gifts, or that can't possibly be true. There must be other kids who are weaker than you, and that's not a good way to, right? Or we'll get your coach, or I'll talk to your school people, and we'll figure this out somehow. But I resisted those impulses, and instead I just said, well, gosh, that must be really hard. That sounds like it must suck to feel that way. And man, I mean, if I felt like everyone else was getting stronger and I wasn't getting strong yet, that makes sense to me, that you'd be really upset. That sounds really hard. So, well, it sure is hard. And they kind of carried on, and she did this kind of just repeating back more or less and say, I understand where you're coming from, and didn't try to talk him out of his version of the truth. He dried his tears a little bit, gave her mom a hug, went to bed. And she said, here's the great part. The next morning, my son comes to me at breakfast with a plan, a written plan for how he thinks he can get stronger, and asks for his mom's help. And in a perfect world, we want to have kids having the experience, and Bill will talk about this in a moment, of being able to solve their own problems with our support, but not our jumping in to solve them for them, because we ultimately can wire kids' brains by this experience of coping with hard situations. Tina Payne Bryson, people may know her as, among other things. The Whole Brain Child has this wonderful line where she says, adversity plus support becomes resilience, where adversity without support is trauma, and kind of adversity with saving is dependence. We want to help kids, but we can principally do this by using empathy and validation to calm those hard emotions, and they'll put them in a position, as this kid did, to start solving the problems for himself, which ultimately, that's really the wiring of the brain that we want kids to have.
And what I love about this story is that some of the stuff in the book, it takes practice. The more you do, you get better at it. What I just love is the fact is that this mother who's heard us lecture came home, just basically changed the energy, to resisted that natural tendency to talk the kid out of it, or to solve the problem for him. And just what happened was that when the energy changed, the kid went into coping mode, and it happened almost immediately. It was really pretty cool. Now, we start the book with this chapter on connection and closeness, empathy. And then we revisit some of the themes we talk about in the self-driven child from a communication point of view. And so the first, and this won't be a hard sell to you folks, is this idea that as our kids get older, we want to think about ourselves more as consultants to our kids than we do as their boss or their manager or their homework police. And certainly your roles as educators, the kind of system you work in, is so much that's what you are. You're consultants to kids to figure out who they want to be, what they want to learn, how can they get there. Yeah, the way we think about it is there's three implications of this parent as consultant model. And one is that we offer help and don't try to force it. And I think that, again, I'm just preaching to the choir here, but I can't tell you how many kids I see in schools who spend 10 units of energy doing schoolwork, and they have adults spending 90 units of energy trying to make them work. And they're using all their energy, resisting other people's attempts to get them to do probably what would be in their own best interest. And I noticed this 30-some years ago, and it seemed this is friggin' crazy. And especially when there's all this fighting about homework. And I learned 60 years ago that homework doesn't contribute to learning, at least in elementary school, and very minimally thereafter. So what's all this freaking fighting about? And so that's where I wrote an article in McCall's magazine. It just said, I just said, tell your kid I love you too much to fight with you about your homework, and just I'll be your homework consultant. I'm happy to. I want to help in any way I can, but I don't want to. I don't want to fight with you all the time, and I don't want to act like somehow it's my responsibility to make you work. I mean, it couldn't be, because I couldn't make you work. All I have to do is flop on the floor or close your eyes. I couldn't make you work. And so this idea is that we want to change the energy, and we want to offer help, not try to force it down kids' throat. As parents, we want to be able to share our wisdom and our experience, because we have a lot more of it than most kids do. It's just that so many kids, the parents say, I keep trying to get them to see, well, change the energy. And so we offer help, we offer advice. And the second implication is that, and we talk about this in the Self-Driven Child, is that with younger kids, we want to encourage them to make decisions. And with very little kids, do you want to do it this way or this way? And just where it's this respectful attitude, like you're a person, you're your own person. You have your own likes and dislikes and wants and stuff you don't want. And we treat them respectfully when they're little. And as they get older, we encourage them more and more to make decisions about stuff, including stuff that's important to them, with our help, with our advice, with our consulting. And with adolescents, it just occurred to me very early in my career that the best message you can give a teenager, besides I love you, is that I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and to learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have a ton of practice doing that before I send you off to college, wherever you go. And the third implication is that we want kids, as Ned was saying, we want kids to solve their own problems as much as possible. What we encourage parents to do is that when kids come home with a problem, remind yourself internally, remind yourself, whose problem is it? Because we're wired because we're mammals, We're wired to protect our young and to soothe our young. And it's just that if we continue to do all the protecting and the soothing, it doesn't help them because it just makes them more anxious. So we want to check, those are the three implications. And we want kids, as I said earlier, to be training a brain that when something stressful happens, instead of saying, mommy, mommy, as they get older, it's turning to trust themselves, to figure it out. Because that's what develops that resilience, that's what develops that high stress tolerance. You know, I gave a talk at a school in Houston about 3 years ago. And I happened to mention the most prestigious high school in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And I don't remember why, but after the lecture, this woman came up to me and said, you know, I work at the Menninger Clinic. I'm a psychotherapist, and I work at the Menninger Clinic here in Houston, this really good mental health clinic in Houston. Says, we know this independent school in DC really well because so many of the kids, they get into the most elite colleges, but they can't handle it emotionally. So they come here for therapy. They take a medical leave and come here for therapy. And she said, 201, they just don't have experience running their own life, solving their own problems, figuring out what's important to them. They've been jumping through hoops their whole life. And I think this provides quite a bit of support for what you folks are doing here. And you think that the most kids getting into the best colleges in the world and either are miserable or not making it there. Something's wrong with this picture. And so what we talk about in this chapter on parent consulting is the language of getting buy-in. And simply, you know, I got an idea about that. Can I run it by you? You know, want my advice? You know, that I wonder what would happen if you did it this way, or you know, for whatever it's worth. I was thinking, we make it tentative. We don't try to force, and we try to get buy-in. So we just aren't going to blathering at kids, and so often kids are like, you know, if kids are resisting, the more you try to push them, the more they resist. And so we want to change that energy, and we want to offer help and advice. And then we also talk about the language of no force. And the idea being, one of the most empowering things that in my experience, that we can do is to remind kids, I'm not going to try to force you to do this. And so many kids feel forced. And I'm often asked to talk kids into stuff. And I tell parents, I don't believe in doing that, but I'll talk to them about it. And I saw this kid right before the pandemic, who mother called my office and talked to my wife and said, he said, would Bill talk my kid into taking medicine for ADHD? He was diagnosed in 2nd grade. He's in 8th grade now, and he's getting all C's, and he's applying out to Catholic high schools. And he had to come to Jesus meeting with the pediatrician a year ago, and he just said, I'm not going to do it. So I sat the kid down, and I just said, you know, I don't want anybody to try to force you to take this medication. I said, actually, if somebody tries to force you, all you do is you put it in your cheek, and then you swallow and you go spit it out. I really don't want anybody forcing you. However, I think it makes sense for you to make an informed decision about it, meaning, why don't you try it and just see what it does? And if it doesn't help you, you don't use it. If there's bad side effects, you don't use it. If it helps you 20%, it's probably not worth it. If it really helps you, you can still decide to use it or not. And this kid, I mean, just almost predictably, in my experience, when we take force off the table, kids they're rational, that they want, because they want their life to work. And so we talk in this chapter about the language of getting buy-in and the language no force. And it really, in pointing out, you know, I trained hundreds of tutors to work with kids with learning disabilities and ADHD in my career. And I always told them, don't work harder to help your kid get better at reading or writing or math or whatever it is than the kid does. And if it feels to you, because you're going to weaken him, because he's going to think that somebody other than him is responsible for his learning. And so it feels to you like you're working harder. Say, I feel like something's wrong with this picture, because I feel like I'm working harder than you are. And I love you too much to do that. And almost always the tutors reported back to me that when they changed the energy that way, the kid kind of would step up the plate.
You know, sort of picking up on that point about, you know, changing the energy, you know, when we have advice and we have, you know, thoughts we want to share with kids, we ideally want to be effective, meaning we like them to actually hear what's going on. And when people are spun up, it's just really hard to, to take in another person's perspective, because you feel like you're being controlled. We introduced in the Self-Driven Child the concept of parents as a non-anxious presence. And it's really predicated on the idea that all emotions are contagious, including fear. And so if I'm super anxious or angry or frustrated, then people around me will be so as well. I mean, the amygdala picks up on stress hormones and in other people's sweat. And so if we want to have kids be able to soothe themselves, to be able to be in the right minds, one of the things that we can do as parents is move in the direction of being a non-anxious presence. And sadly, I mean, particularly for those of you who are longtime educators, it doesn't seem like the world's moving in that direction. I mean, I've been doing test prep since 1993, and I can remember the first kid I had who had extra time on an SAT because of anxiety. And I'm like, wait, that's a thing. And now decades later, I assume that kind of everyone has it because it's just so darn prevalent. And Bill and I don't know what 26, 27 states we've lectured in, and it's just everywhere. I mean, you think that Princeton has cornered the market on stress, or DC or New York, and it's the same thing in Chicago, and second graders in Seattle in full school refusal. There are fifth grade boys in Texas who are overwhelmed by the pressure of doing well enough on the math test because this is going to matter for college. I mean, it's just a little bit nuts. And it seems to us that, it's a cautionary tale, but it's also reason to not necessarily, this family or that school or this, whatever. These are things that are messages that are just kind of in the zeitgeist and stress that is in the air. And so we spent a little time kind of thinking about what's going on, kind of what is the drip feed that grown-ups who are, who really created the environment the kids learn in and grow up in, how are we kind of conveying this drip feed of fear? Some of it's through our language we'll talk about in a minute. Some of it is clearly through, tracking apps and, online portals and, Life 360 and all these kind of things that really are giving a constant message of, it's not safe for you to go out in the world by yourself. I need to know where you are at every moment in which your grade is down to the tenth of a point. Otherwise, obviously bad things will happen. And certainly the acceleration, I think, in the last couple of decades of parents feeling like they have to be wildly involved, if not over involved, in kind of every aspect of their kid's life, particularly their learning. There's a wonderful researcher named Jessie Borelli out of UC Irvine, who studies parental control, really parental over control. And she has this really neat experiment that I think exemplifies what's going on at a neurological level. So she brings these kids into her lab, 12, 13-year-old kids, plugs them down in front of a computer to do a digital puzzle. And it's putting pieces together to make a rectangle. Looks pretty easy. Turns out it's not. And they've brought parents along, in this case, moms, for kind of moral support, with one instruction: just don't tell the kid how to do it. You can encourage them, but don't tell them how to do it. Really, what they're testing is this. As the kids do the puzzle, it looks easy. It's not. They start out confident. They get frustrated. The more frustrated they get, the more distressed they get. And they can tell because the kid's wearing a heart rate monitor and it goes up and up and up. And the more stressed out the kid gets, the loving mom who wants to help, who's been told she's not allowed to, she gets stressed because she has a heart rate monitor on too. And eventually, more than she can handle. And she just breaks the one and only rule: don't help, and says, no, sweetheart, move it over there. Try it to left. Oh, maybe the other side. And when she finally, stops biting her tongue and gets off her hands, oh, it feels so good to actually do something to help in some way. And you can tell this because her heart, and it feels just good to do something. Woohoo! Except
Sense
there's
of
one
control is a
problem.
big deal, buddy.
Yep, sense of control is a big deal. And the problem is she now has more control and her kid has less. And his heart rate, it just keeps going off the charts. And of course, that's not going to be good for visual spatial reasonability or the relationship at dinner time, for that matter. Here's the great part. Even though fear is contagious, calm is too. Turns out calm is contagious. Someone told us this is the mantra of the Navy SEALs. And these are people who are probably in relatively high stress jobs relative to what most of us do on a day in basis. And they know that when the person or people who are in charge are like, we have a plan for this, we're going to work the problem, and they don't go to pieces, it makes everyone else around them also be more calm and be able to think more clearly. So how do we communicate calm? How do we communicate confidence? Certainly some of it's through language. We love the work of John and Julie Gottman, if you even know these folks who have studied relationships for decades and find that in order to keep things kind of, above board, happy, such that if I occasionally snap or get impatient with my wife or my kids or whatever, like, well, dad's having a bad day, as opposed to, God, he's a son of a gun, right? And pile on, kind of keep things above board. Because negative interactions are more impactful than positive ones, they have found that to keep things, everything's kind of shiny happy, we need to have 5-to-1 positive to negative interactions to keep things where we want them to be. And this made sense because when we looked at language, it turns out that positive words are like 5 times more powerful than negative words. If you put someone in a functional MRI and just say the word no, you can just, these cascading effects of stress across the brain. And so we want to, as educators, we want to, as parents, be very purposeful, try not to be controlling, try to be more positive than negative, and it's even just things like when things aren't going well, boy, that looks hard, the empathy and validation, like we talked about on the other page, but also, in my experience, these things usually find a way of working themselves out okay. Or if you got a kid who's really things aren't going well, so, kiddo, I love you no matter what you do, or honest to gosh, even how hard you work, it's okay. Or, for kids who are perfectionistic, in my experience, you don't have to be the best at everything. You don't even have to be good at everything. You just have to be good enough at some things that matter to you. And the last thing from our perspective is practicing, employing practices that lower stress. Simply put, for any family, for any person, if the inflows of stress are not balanced by outflows of stress that are healthy, then over time, the stress builds up and bad things happen from a mental health perspective, from a relationship perspective. Bill has been a practitioner of transcendental meditation for 47 years now? Yep. He's pretty much impossible to freak out. I've been at this for about 10 years. My wife picked this up a couple of years ago, and this is why I think it's a useful example. This summer, our 19-year-old son, who's kicking around someplace, he's home from college, getting treatment for a brain tumor that he had the bad fortune to acquire over the summer. Fortunately, he's a good kid, so he chose the right kind that's most amenable to treatment. So we're nearly out of the woods, and hopefully get to celebrate different hairlines in the new year. But the thing that was interesting to me was a couple weeks into this, my wife, this is all we talked about, and she said, "You know what? It's been like 3 people who have said to me, 'How are you so calm about all of this?'" Now, part of it is we're very fortunate to have some really good medical care and got with the right people here in DC, and we're given messages that suggest that the statistics are all, he chose the right type of brain tumor. But she said, honest to gosh, I don't think I would be handling this the way that I don't think in the past I would have handled it the way that I think I'm handling now. And I think it's the meditation. And goodness knows, we had a lot more stress coming in. I don't recommend it to anyone. But she also had a tool in a healthy way to relieve stress so that my wonderful wife and I could both we couldn't ever say, we know this is going to be okay, but we could say, we're confident this is going to work out okay, because you're a strong kid and you got a great team and everything looks like it's moving in the right direction. So TM may not be the thing for everyone, but we feel like everyone needs to have something, if not things, as healthy ways to blow off stress, because goodness knows that the last year has shown us there are all sorts of ways to have more stress in our lives.
I'll just mention, I know this kid in New York and his mom, and they learned TM together maybe 6-7 years ago. And the mom's is well connected and had a reporter from the New York Times come over and write an article about these two meditating together. And the kid was asked, "What do you notice from the meditation?" And he said, "TM calms the mind and it calms the mom." She was able to become a more non-anxious presence in her family. And we also, the other theme that we revisit from our first book is motivation. And as I mentioned earlier, we really lean on the self-determination theory. And what we've noticed is every place we've been, as Ned said, is that people, they don't focus on autonomy very much and relatedness to some extent, but what they really focus on in schools, and this is partly why what you do is so important, that what they focus on is the competence part, the achievement part. And while we were writing our new book, we saw this survey, this paper written through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that looked at the major causes of mental health problems in adolescents. And the first 4 were poverty, trauma, discrimination, and excessive pressure to excel. And we know that we used to think that really affluent kids who have everything, every opportunity do better mental health wise, but it turns out that actually middle class kids do better than these kids in these high achieving schools, wealthy kids in high achieving schools, who are much higher risk than most kids for anxiety disorders, depression, and even into young adulthood, into mid-20s, at higher risk for substance use disorders. And so we think that there's overemphasis on competence and autonomy at the expense of competence, at the expense of autonomy and relatedness. That focusing on, as Ned said, so many parents feel that if kids aren't working hard in school, they have to be constantly disapproving. And we're suggesting this message: I love you no matter how hard you work. That kind of unconditional acceptance. And and also we talk in the book about the futility of trying to motivate kids through fear or guilt or anger. And I tell a story about having gone to a school meeting at a Catholic school, and about an 8th grade boy who I had tested. And he had learning disabilities, he had a language disorder, he had ADHD. School was really hard for him. And also in 8th grade, applying out to Catholic high schools. And I go to this meeting, and they say, well, the kid's he won't do anything unless somebody's on him constantly. And I said, well, change that energy. But then a little bit later, the principal said, I've already had 2 meetings with him to try to get him to see how important it is he start to work harder so he has more options for high school. And I said, I respectfully want to suggest that I think he's pretty aware that if he does better, he'd have more options. And my guess is he's probably tried quite often to do better and just found it, because he has all these learning issues, that even if he tries really hard, he doesn't do that well. So what's the point? We also know that the major manifestation of anxiety is avoidance. We avoid stuff that makes us anxious. And it's got to be that the schoolwork is so stressful for him that it makes him really anxious even to think about it. So of course he avoids it. I said, let's tell him, let's just tell him, where you go to high school, it's just not that big a deal. I mean, who's going to care when you're 30 where you went to high school? It's just not a big a deal. And I want
learning
to
cooperative, and then it's everything. So there's that.
Yeah, right.
And then that'll make all the difference.
Right. And so I just let's just tell him. Let's try to lower the fear. Let's try to lower the pressure in this kid. And when they liked the idea, it made sense to them. This avoidance idea really made sense to them. He's just avoiding stuff because it makes so anxious. So they focus on helping them understand it's safe to work hard because you don't have to turn this around immediately. And actually, the kid did better, and he got into a really good high school that has a really supportive program for kids with learning disabilities. And it's not magic. I just saw him again 3 years later, and he's still, I mean, it kind of goes up and down, but he's so much more better, so much more independent than he was at that time. And so we just want to minimize the extent to which we're using, and that's what you folks do. I mean, you have a very safe environment for kids, and you don't use fear, you don't use guilt, and it's stuff that just doesn't work. And we also we talk about wanting kids to work hard. We like quite a bit of Carol Dweck's work on mindset theory. We don't like everything about it, but we like something about it. But we also say, I want you to work hard, but I also want you to play hard, because there's so much evidence that kids become self-motivated through really passionately pursuing stuff they really love to do. When they're little, whether it's building Legos or whether it's rock climbing or whether it's sports or music, whatever it is, that trains a brain to develop the kind of that intrinsic motivation. And so when we talk about motivation, I'll just also mention, we talk about how powerful just making an offhand comment can be in terms of motivating kids. And when I work with kids, especially kids who I've been told give up easily, and I'll give them something that's kind of interesting and they'll stick with it. And I won't say anything right away, but a couple hours later or an hour later, I'll say, when I was watching you do this thing, that what I noticed is that you didn't give up. You weren't a kid who just gives up. And then I kind of let it go. I said, I love that about you. I love the fact that with hard stuff, you just continue to work hard. That's a beautiful thing. It's going to make you successful. And then I just drop it. I don't come back to it because I remember as a kid how often I'd remember something somebody said kind of just off the top of their head or the spur of the moment, and it stuck with me for years and years and years. So we talk about that as well. And Ned, you got a pretty good story about that. Offhand comment.
It's just fun. It's this idea of offhand comments, that things that are one that are kind of unexpected and don't feel pre-planned, and also are
that unexpected is really important. That's great.
Fewer words rather than more. I had this kid I was working with. Again, I do all this kind of jury test prep, and she went to a pretty academic school here in the area, and had an older sister who was really classically academic in ways that were harder for this kid. And so a lot of self-doubt, and can get down on herself a bit. So we're doing I don't remember what it was we're doing, and she gets this problem right. And it was a hard problem, not just for her, but like most people miss this. And I was like, huh. And she said, what? I said, that was kind of geeky. She said, what? I said, most people just don't get that right. And that was cool. Nothing more. She kind of like cocks it like, smiles a little and puts her head back down and goes back to work. She eventually goes on, gets this lovely score, for her, goes off to the college that she wants to. Every time she had a break, she'd come back and say hi. We were just pals. She was just a really neat kid. And then at her, first Christmas break, I get this card from her, dear Ned, I'm loving college. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Thank you so much. I don't know that I could have gotten these SAT scores and would be here without them, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure that's true, but then at the very end, she says, and thanks for making me a geek. And it was so fun because, she wanted to be and think of herself as academic, but I think somewhere she wasn't sure it was safe. Could I that's the kid that Bill was talking about. Is it safe for me to try to, lay a claim to that? Because I'm not sure if I can do this. And my sister's already blazed the trail and blah, blah, blah. And just this little sense of, I see this in you. I see this in you. And then she, of course, did all the hard work and went and ran with it. And part of all this, so much of the language that we're trying to use with kids is about motivating, is about making them feel safe in the world, helping them be able to soothe themselves, but also helping them to be able to get unstuck, right? Our fears as parents or as educators when kids are struggling is not about the, math test now or the history class, this year. It's about what the future, what that portends about where they're going to end up. And so it can be really easy when we see kids really struggling to think, if we can fix this thing now, we'll change the trajectory. The problem is people resist change if they feel like they're controlled. And we know you can't change people against their will. But we understand how important this is to try to create the environment, to try to change the energy, as Bill mentioned, to try to use our language in effective ways to help kids, if they want to, change themselves. And so in this chapter, we talk about it's the language and silence of change. And it's based on motivational interview and the work of William Miller and Steve Rolnick, who in the 80s worked with problem drinkers, and classically with problem drinkers, alcoholics. You sort of, Ned, if you don't stop drinking, man, your wife's going to leave you. You're going to lose your job. You can lose your house. You can lose your health. I mean, my God, you've got to stop this. As though if you gave me one more terrifying outcome that was going to happen. And what happened? I'd go into denial, right? I'd fight back of the people who loved me and just tell them they didn't understand, that they didn't know what they're talking about. So the insights that William Miller principally fell onto were these. One, people have a righting reflex. When people bring a problem to us, particularly ones people really love, we have this tendency to want to make it right. That's our reflex. If you did this, if you did that, we try to talk people out of hard feelings, all these things. The second one, this is where it gets complicated, is that people are ambivalent about change. So if we go back to that kid who was not doing so hot in 8th grade, it wasn't lost on him, as Bill said, that if he got better grades, he'd have more high school choices, but also that his teachers would be less stressed. They'd be more approving of him. His parents would be happier with him. His friends who kind of think he's a knucklehead might actually hold him in a little bit higher regard. All really good things, all reasons to change. But he also knows he'd have to study stuff that maybe is really boring, or he'd have to study stuff that's hard, or he'd have to give up time with his friends or Xbox or whatever else he'd rather be doing with his time. And also that he could work as hard as he could, really give it his all, and get grades that were a little better, And then he'd really know what the limits of his ability are, where now he could say, well, my grades aren't very good, but if I wanted to, I could. And he has that self-protection. So the way out of this, the tools of motivational interviewing are these, that we try to create the situation for change talk, meaning we use open-ended questions, this reflective listening, so kids can begin to articulate for themselves the reason to not fight against what's in their own best interest. Because when I argue all the reasons to work hard, the kid will argue all the reasons why it's impossible to do it. So the story in our book is this. We have a friend who's a really talented school psychologist. She caught wind of a kid who was smoking a lot of pot, and she arranged a meeting with her. First thing, as Bill said, she takes the force off the table. I'm not going to try to talk you out of smoking pot. Won't be the umpteenth adult that tells you all the reasons why. I know you've heard it. You're a smart kid. You understand that. I am, though. I'm interested. I'd love to understand what your experience is with smoking pot. You know, kind of what are you getting out of it right now? The girl goes on to tell her about, you know, how she likes the kids she hangs out with. They're really funny. They're cool. She feels cool hanging out with these kids. She feels funnier when she's high, a whole lot less stress. Stuff isn't getting done, but she doesn't feel so bad about it. And on it goes. Our friend repeats this all back to her to make sure she's, you know, understanding and the kid feels understood. And then, but at some point, the girl then does let slip. It is kind of expensive, though. Easy place for us to jump in. Well, there's your reason. Instead, our friend open-ended questions. Well, tell me more about that. What's that like? Well, you know, I buy a couple times a week and that's pretty much all the money I have, so on and so forth. Well, that makes sense. If you had more money, I'm curious, what would you do with it? Oh, well, my friend Bill has these really cute shoes, but I'd probably get mine in blue, you know, and I haven't done my hair in a while. I think I'd probably get my hair done. Repeats it all back. Well, you know, thanks for sharing that with me. Nothing more, walks away. Sees the girl a couple weeks later. She has her hair done. Kind of sidles up to her, say, hey, your hair looks cute. Tell me about that. Oh, well, yeah, last week I decided I'd just buy once and I smoked a little less. So I got my hair. Do you like it? I really do. It looks good on you. And the final insight is simply that we can create the environment by which it feels safe for kids to go from one side of the teeter-totter to argue the other side, because they recognize the pros and cons. And for a kid or for anyone, including a problem drinker, to articulate for themselves the reasons to change the behavior, even when they feel stuck, so much more powerful than have someone else lay the reasons on them. And then they don't fight what is arguably, obviously, in their own best interest.
And I love this chapter on the language and silence of change, in part because so many parents say, how do I motivate my kid? And what they're really saying is, how do I change my kid? And the answer is, you don't. I mean, unless the kid really wants you to help them, then you can help. And we also talk about, I don't know how many of you have heard of this new program out of Yale for treating childhood anxiety and adolescence that only works with parents. And it's so interesting. It's called the SPACE. It's an acronym, SPACE. It's an acronym for Supported Parenting of Anxious Childhood Emotions. And the idea is that it's the same kind of idea that this program developed. People studied Gandhi. They studied Gandhi and nonviolent resistance and the power of nonviolent resistance, bring the British Empire to its knees. Martin Luther King making these profound changes through nonviolent resistance. And they realized that just by changing their energy, changing their steps in a family dance, parents have so much power really to help their kids. And so the premise is that, as we've been saying, because we're mammals, that if our kids are anxious, we're wired to try to protect them from anything that's going to make them anxious and to soothe them as they get older. But then, so we make a combination. So you got a kid who is afraid to sleep by himself, and he's 7 years old. He sleeps in the bed with you, or a kid who is afraid of standing for the bus, and you wait with him, or a kid who's afraid to be in the same room at home, but being alone in a room at home, so that you make sure he's never in a room alone. And it turns out that those, what they call accommodations, they make kids less anxious in the moment, but over time they make kids actually more anxious. And so what this program involved is two things. One is parents increasing the number of supportive statements to their kids, which is things like, I know that being in your bedroom by yourself makes you anxious. And I used to think you couldn't handle it, but I was wrong. I'm 100% confident that you can handle any kind of anxiety that comes up being in your own room. And then you explain later, you explained that I'm not going to follow your room to room anymore. But it's changing the accommodations and making the supportive statements where start with empathy. I know this is really anxiety arousing for you, and confidence, expressing that confidence that kids can handle stuff. And it's proven to be as effective. This SPACE program has proven to be as effective in reducing anxiety in kids as cognitive behavioral therapy is for the kids themselves. And so we just love this idea that we have so much power, but by not trying to change kids, not trying to force, but by changing our own energy, our own steps, our own steps in the dance. We love that idea.
I'm going to talk about, I'm just looking at the clock, Bill. Do you want me to talk about sleeping technology, or do you want to share a little bit about our thoughts on happiness?
Well, let's take questions on sleep. We have a chapter on Talk with Kids about the hard ones, meaning sleep and technology, because that's the stuff you get parents get the most pushback about. Let's take questions about that, but let's talk about the happiness piece.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah,
so Bill was given a lecture in a private school in Dallas, and a bunch of student leaders, my 10th graders, and he asked them, how many of you want to be happy as adults? And they all kind of sheepishly raised their hands like, well, duh. And so he said, well, what do grownups tell you? What do they tell you it's necessary to be happy as an adult? And they all gave versions of, well, we understand if we get into a good enough college, then everything else will fall into place. And we thought, oh man, if only that were true. I mean, I'd be the most overcompensated guy in the world because I'm not able to get into college. Get higher test scores and you'll be happy, right? And, we thought, how could they get this so wrong, right? I mean, if that were the case, people at Yale would be among the happiest people in the world, as opposed to 60% of them are clinically depressed or anxious. And that class by Laura Santos on teaching them how to be happy, the most oversubscribed class in the history of Yale. And we end up looking at the research that people probably know, Martin Seligman out of Penn, who teaches who founded the study of positive psychology, rather than what's wrong with dysfunction and where are people unhappy. What do we actually know about people who are happy, who are thriving? What's going on? And he has this formula which is really lovely. It's PERMA. And so P is positive emotions, and some of that is just kind of how you're wired, a little more glass half full, but also practices gratitude and cultivating on Shinrin-yoku and all sorts of things like that. But in addition to positive emotions, engagement, right? That flow experience, the passionate pursuit of pastimes, as Bill was saying before, relationships, right? Goodness, wouldn't it be nice if we thought about our classmates as friends, right? Rather than competition. Meaning, right? Deeply engaged in things that whether it's your faith or it's justice in the world. What are things that give people a deep sense of I'm making the world a better place and I'm spending time on things that are really profoundly important to me. And the last A is achievement, right? Or accomplishment, and that's important. But it's 1/5 of the equation, and we too often see in the families with whom we work that they sacrifice several, if not all four of the first four, to get accomplishment, achievement. It's not like kids are unhappy because they're at Yale are unhappy because they're not achieving enough. I mean, Bill and I were out in Palo Alto and giving a talk pre-COVID, and the week before we were there, the 2 weeks before there were 2 suicides, including a kid who was an Olympic athlete.
It's Stanford.
Thank you. It's Stanford. Yes. Thank you for adding that. I mean, you think these are they've achieved everything. And what we so often see is much like those kids Bill was talking about, the miniature clinic, they sacrifice everything, including their mental health, to get achievement. And they achieve everything, but then don't have the brain states either that are resilient for stress, but also that fundamentally struggle to be happy and to enjoy that hard-earned achievement. So we just feel like we could start talking a whole lot earlier, even through our own, conversation and modeling as parents, talking about the relationships and why they nurture us, really demonstrating to our kids our involvement with things that are there, whether it's engagement or things that give us meaning, and not sacrifice everything on the altar of achievement. So
Joel would be happy to take questions.
Yeah, let's do some questions. So we have one already, which I'll throw out there. So if other people have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll feed those in here. So the question was, how would you approach a situation where parents perceive something as a problem and kids don't share that same perception? video game use, on down the line.
Do you want to start, Ned, or do you want me to?
You go ahead, Bill.
So,
I defer to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me when I used to do psychotherapy many years ago with kids is that you can't make somebody want what they don't want, and you can't make them not want what they want. And so I think that our approach to video games specifically, we talk about this in both of our books. The new book, we basically take this idea, this consultative idea, that when kids are little, we negotiate limits with them, and as they get older, once, especially the last 2-3 years of high school, you don't want to send a kid off to college who's never had to wrestle with his use of technology, because they'll be home by November. And so we want in the words of I'm just blanking on her name,
Deborah Heitner.
Yeah, Deborah Heitner.
Yes.
Mentor, not monitor. And so what we want to do is our role is not to set limits on a kid's technology and find out a way to shut off the internet until they go to college. Our goal is eventually to help a kid figure out, God, this stuff is so addictive, I need to cut back. And I think with kids who are playing too many video games, that we want to do is we want to negotiate. And the first thing we suggest is that, as we say about a lot of things, show interest, seek to understand. Because so many of the parents that we work with, all the energy about video games is no, stop, less. And it gets hard to really get a kid involved in negotiating limits if we don't see a side. So we suggest playing it, sitting and watching the kid play. God, I can see why you love this so much. Play with them, because then it gets easier. We as that was saying with smoking pot, if we kind of just acknowledge, we understand why this is so cool, then kids know. Kids know to spend too much. They really do know. I asked a bunch of ninth graders, in Houston, a couple of years ago, a class of ninth graders. I said, "How many of you are in front of a screen more than you think you should be?" And every single one of them raised their hand. They knew. They're all ambivalent about this, and so I think that the stuff in our new book about motivational interviewing, the chapter in technology itself about how you can have these discussions with, we don't want parents to basically allow kids to do things that they don't feel right about. And so you kind of let kids know. We recommend this collaborative problem solving approach where you start out with empathy. I understand, I think I understand your feeling. Here's my feeling about it. Let's see if we can find something that works for both of us. Ned, add on.
Yeah, there's a story in the book. My 19-year-old who is ADHD. He's just an incredible human, very dreamy, and always been transfixed by things on a screen. When he was 2 and 3, if we went into a 7-Eleven and he could catch sight of the Keno, we could have come back 2 weeks later and he'd still be sitting there staring at the numbers popping up. It's just he's got the brain that he's got. And there's a story in the book in his sophomore year. The game Fortnite came through our house like a biblical plague, and it was just, he was so sucked up into it, partly because it's a well-designed game and it was fun. He was hanging out with these kids, friends of his online. He just really enjoyed it. So he has on a Thursday night, he has a day off of school, it's Friday off of school. And so I asked him, "So what are you going to do with your day tomorrow?" Now, my son's a music major, really talented musician. So I was hoping he's going to compose something, he's going to arrange something, whatever. And he just smiles and says, "Play Fortnite." And I'm like, okay, great. Anything else? I'll think about it. Well, have fun. Okay, great. So I go to bed. I go off to work the next day. I come home like 6 o'clock. There's my kid, blowing things, shooting people, all this kind of thing. Woohoo! And I'm like, dude, it's 6 o'clock because he's still in his pajamas. I'm like, really? So I was a little hot, I admit. Wasn't exactly non-accident. Can you please finish? Win, die, whatever. Because weren't we going to go out for pizza? Oh yeah. He's more easygoing than his dad. So he finishes up, whatever, gets dressed. We go off and have pizza. I come down. I managed to say nothing more. Saturday, I say nothing more. Sunday, I say nothing more until about 5 o'clock, when, if you have a teenage boy, particularly one who procrastinates, this is the witching hour. And he goes, "Oh, darn, wait, tomorrow's Monday." And all the stuff that he's been not doing, comes back into his head. And now he's pretty frustrated. He's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I wasted all of Friday. Why did I just always play video games? So if ever there were like a parental opportunity for like, I told you this was it, but we're in the middle of writing this book, so that didn't seem like the lines I should be using. So sort of best empathy and validation, so can you, a couple questions, if I may. How long do you think you spent playing Fortnite? Maybe 9, 8, 10 hours, maybe. Wow. Was it fun? Oh, it was great. We won 4 times. We got new skins, whatever. Terrific. I'm so glad. Another question though. If you think about it, how many hours do you think would have been necessary to kind of, get your Fortnite fix? Maybe 4 or 5. Great. And then you could have done other stuff. Yeah, that probably would have worked out better. Last question. In the future, would it help? Would it help if mom or I tried to help you just manage use of technology, kind of put some guardrails on it so you can play and we're not controlling it, but we help you just kind of, keep it where you want to be and not feel like you wasted your whole day? Yeah, that would actually be really good. And now we had buy-in, as Bill talked about before. Now we get to be his technology consultants. And I always knew this about him, right? He didn't get a proper Xbox until the start of the COVID, because that seems like a good time to get a senior year of high school. But I also knew that even though it's the kid who was really attracted to these things, he had to struggle with these with our help. Because at sophomore, he was 2.5 years away from going off to college with our hopes and dreams, all of his clothes, and a suitcase full of our money. And if we had been full command and control, and he only could, and he was well controlled with his use of technology rather than self-controlled, he would have been back, as Bill said, 2 months into college, because he needed to struggle with this, and which includes not always doing things well, because it's kind of how we learn. So we really try to take this, we advocate this collaborative approach, thinking of ourselves as consultants, offering help, offering advice, but trying to understand where the kid is coming from, including what are you getting out of this video game? Not in an accusatory way, but I really want to understand this, because when we do that, we again get that buy-in. And we don't excite the ambivalence response where they argue against doing the thing that they also know that they should be doing.
We had another question that just came in, which I'd be interested to hear. So it says, can you talk about kids different ages and autonomy? For example, 15 and 10-year-old boys being at different life and development stages. Do the approaches differ?
There's a lot of research that from very early on, supporting autonomy in kids is very beneficial. And I think I mentioned this in Self-Driven Child, but part of the reason I emphasize a lot kids making decisions for themselves is I want them to, part of the way you learn to run your own life is you make your own decisions and you learn from your mistakes. And I remember in the first few years of my career, it was very common in public schools for the kids to repeat a grade, usually kindergarten, first grade. And I was struck by how many 19-year-olds I test, and they'd say, "Where are you in school?" They say, "Well, I'm a freshman in college. I should be a sophomore, but my parents made me repeat the first grade." They're still pissed about it 12 years later. And it seemed like maybe we could handle this in a different way, that it doesn't carry this huge scar and this resentment over these years. So I started saying, tell your kid, nobody's going to make you repeat the grade. It's going to be your call. But I want you to talk with your teachers. I want you to talk with the principal. I want you to talk with Dr. Stixrud. And so you can make a good decision. And I was blown away by the fact that these 6 and 7-year-old kids, they'd think all summer about whether they're ready. And sometimes some of the kids would say at the end of the summer, they say, "I know I'm not ready. And so I want to stay back in first grade. And if people call me stupid, I know I'm not stupid. I can handle it." And other kids would say, I think I'm ready to go on, but if I need a tutor, can I go on? And it seemed to me that these 6 and 7-year-olds could make as good a decision for themselves as I could. And I'm not suggesting at all that 6 and 7-year-olds make all their own decisions. I am suggesting that nurturing, that supporting that autonomy, you're the expert on you. Nobody knows you better than you do. And certainly by the time, I know the person who has the question asks about 10 and 15-year-olds, and 10-year-olds, that if the 3 implications of this consultant model are offering advice and offering help, not trying to force, it applies to 10 and 15-year-olds. The decision-making, we want to be requiring 15-year-olds to make their own decisions so they have practice doing it, and they learn to trust themselves. And with the 10-year-olds, we want to support them and encourage them to make their own decisions. And the third part, solving their own problems, you can start that when they're really little. So I'm not saying that kids get to be the boss of everything, but we also say in our first book, on the chapter on decision making, that we want to go with kids' decisions unless they're crazy, and meaning unless virtually any reasonable person would say that's a terrible idea. Because am I frozen?
You're good.
Yeah, very often, a kid may want to do something, and the parents don't agree with it, but it's not crazy. And because we don't know ahead of time how a decision is going to turn out, but how it's going to affect you a year from now, or 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we think the best message, even for pretty young kids, is that I want this to be your call. Ned, do you add on, buddy?
Yeah, when I just add to, I mean, when we, I remember the first complete sentence that I wrote a book about stress in the SAT, and my daughter at that age was 2. And she wanted to, for whatever reason, she was hell bent on putting her own pajamas on. Well, pulling pajamas over bottom that is very big with a diaper on it, when your arms aren't that long, is hard to do. But doggone it, she was determined to do it. And my wife is watching this, could see her struggling. Well, Katie, do you want some help? I do it. And she, she kept struggling. My wife kept offering help, and she just, I do it. And she was just hell bent on it, right? You see 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds say, you're not the boss of me. And this is just their way of saying, I don't like to be told what to do. And that's true for all human beings. I mean, I forget if you mentioned at the beginning, Bill, there's the Sonia Lupian, who heads the Center for Studies of Human Stress in Montreal, has this wonderful acronym of what makes people stressed, of what makes us nuts. So N is novelty, U, unpredictability, T, perceived threat, and S, a low sense of control. And this is what the whole thing of self-driven child was about, that a low sense of control is the most stressful thing that people can face. Now, in addition to age differences of a toddler to a 10-year-old to a teen, there are also enormous differences just in how people are wired. Some people are really easygoing. My son, my 19-year-old, he's just one of the most easygoing people in the world. My daughter is determined and resolute and occasionally stubborn as a person can be. But part of it is also tied, she just has a more sensitive stress response. It's just the way that she's wired. And it's not better or worse. It's just is who she is. So in my experience, you can feel when kids, if kids are getting frustrated or impatient or hostile, oftentimes, and they're ready to have a tantrum or burst in tears, oftentimes it's just their stress response going off. And what they may simply need is feeling like they're more in control, that they're not having things forced on them. I would say a caveat to this, and this really Bill's point of not having a 6-year-old around the household, is that a healthy sense of control is simply kids being given the option to make decisions, to do things for themselves that they credibly can do for themselves. If we give things to kids that are overwhelming to them, that are more than they can handle, it's not a source of happiness and low stress. It's overwhelming. And I occasionally get that. I mean, we often get, people ask, well, what if you have a kid who doesn't want to make a decision? And I had a kid, do you want to do this test or that test? I don't know, you decide for me. So I'm happy to make this decision for you, but I just want to have your input. We'll get a pro con, and then if you want to, I'll make the decision for you, and then you don't follow up. But by the way, if you had to make the decision, I'll do it. But if you had to, what would be your decision? Because we don't want to push people into doing things they don't want to do. We sure don't want to deprive them of opportunity to do things that they really can do or feel that they can do. And it's probably the feeling that you can do it that's even more important than the ability to do it.
Yeah, we had another question. Just basically, are there any situations or, where parental pressure would be good, justified, useful, anything?
Well, I think that certainly we want parents to be assertive. We don't want kids to have too much power in their family. We don't want kids to see their parents as kind of their friends. I mean, I think that as adults, we have a natural authority with kids, but we blow it if we try to force, if we get mad and start yelling or like that. This blow, the kind of natural authority comes from being older and more experienced. And so And in both books, we talk about the fact that we want in the decision making, support kids in making their own decision, unless they're crazy or unless they're really depressed, because by definition, kids are really depressed. They can't think straight. They're involved in drugs where they can't think straight, or they're just in denial. There's such strong denial that they don't have an accurate model of the reality they're living. And there are times when we have to do power plays. We have to forget we put a kid in therapy where there wants to be a knot, that kind of thing. But I think that for the most part, if we're feeling not right about something, use this collaborative problem solving. Have a meeting with the kid. Start with empathy. Be assertive about yourself. Be clear about this isn't working for me. Let's figure something out.
We also have in our new book, What Do You Say? We have a chapter about expectations. And we know that parental expectations, including in education, are hugely predictive of how kids do. But healthy expectations are couched in, I expect that, it's my sense that this is something that you can do really well at this. I have every reason to think that you can really, be great in, piano, violin, sports, education, whatever it is. But the confidence that I think you can do well is qualitatively different from the expectation pressure that I expect you to do this, that if somehow you don't do this, then my approval of you is conditional on your doing well in this. It's simply that I believe that you can really do this. We talk about the story of two sweatshirts of was that Hope in the Unseen, is that Ron Suskind, and it's about a family in Baltimore, under-resourced family, where no one in their family had ever gone to college. And she buys her little boy a Harvard sweatshirt and says that, I believe that you have everything you can to go to a place like Harvard if that's what you want to do. Really to talk back against the societal message that people like us don't go to colleges like that. Where we were at a school out in Seattle where they have all the kids in like kindergarten all coming in wearing Harvard, Princeton, Stanford sweatshirts, right? All of them. And if they don't go there, if they don't follow their parents' alma mater, that they're going to disappoint their parents. And the school counselor, they just kind of shook her head saying, statistically, there's just no way that most of these kids get to go to the same college that their parents went to. And so, pressure, from our perspective, supportive expectations of, I think you can do this rather than I expect you to do this. I think that the how the energy feels, again, if a kid feels supported rather than pressured, I think we're in a better place.
And also, I'll just mention, we have a chapter, the last chapter in the book is called "What About Consequences?" Because we've been lecturing all over the country until the pandemic, just hundreds of schools, and parent lecture series and that kind of stuff. And because we focus so much on autonomy, parents will often ask, "But what about what about consequence? What about limits?" So we have a chapter at the end of the book that talks about, we believe in natural consequences. This kid does something and we don't jump in to try to rescue him, so he experiences the consequence of it. Logical consequences where the kid that can make sense if they're agreed on in advance. And we also, but we so often the kids who get the most consequences learn the least from them. And so we want to be clear that from discipline point of view, what discipline really means is to teach. And the key to teaching is, as you folks know, that in the student-centered learning, you know this, the key to teaching is relationship. And that's that you have the other opportunity to really develop relationships with kids. And it's, I think a lot of the times, the limits we set and the way we set limits, the way we think that everything has to have a consequence, can interfere with our relationship. So we have a fairly kind of nuanced discussion about that in the end of the book.
And kind of along those lines, we have another question, just sort of about family values. It's kind of a long question, but you can read it there. But just talking about how do these family values get developed, and what happens, or how do you approach it if kids kind of reject those values? If you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there's, I certainly love the idea of people making them sitting down together. My wife's cousin has it's the Patton family values, and they sat down with their kids when they're like 5 and 7 of, things that we believe in, and it's working hard and playing, and playing fair and cleaning up our own messes and these kind of things. And so I think it's a wonderful way for parents to discuss, or caregivers to discuss what's important to them, and for kids to have a voice in that. I mean, I think kind of the legitimacy of authority is really predicated on the authority being able to listen to the people on whom this this authority is projected. To say that we're a family who believe in music, and we really want everyone in this family to love music and to explore learning an instrument. That's very different from, we're a family of musicians. We expect everyone in here to be an expert violinist or pianist. I saw the question about the biblical plague, where again, we're trying to share this is a love of not if you don't do this, that you're somehow not part of this family. I mean, I was talking with some parents, and then they were talking about their, I guess, junior year daughter, and just like, oh my God, the child questions everything that we tell her. And I said, that's fantastic. And they looked at me like I was insane. I said, no. You do not want to send your daughter out in the world if she just reflexively takes up whatever anyone tells her she's supposed to believe. If she walks around and says, is that really true? Is that really true? And thinks it over and thinks it over and thinks it over. And then she comes around and like, they have a solid point there. Then these are her beliefs, because she's really she's watched you model these things. She's heard you talk about the importance of them, and she's had the chance to try it on for their own, right? And the reason why the Amish, let their teenagers before adulthood go off for a year, and explore the world and see what the non-Amish world is like, so that it's done willingly. So I think there's value, particularly if you go back to the permit, in talking about what, for me as a dad, gives me fulfillment, what gives me meaning, and share that with my kids, but not force it down their throat, because they're not me. They may live a life that looks a lot like mine, and they may not, and that's on them. It's my job to support them in building that. As Bill would say, a happy life is a life that the kids want to have, that people want to have.
And we talk about this in quite. There's a long answer to the question of, in our family we think music is really important. We all value it. My kid doesn't want to practice, and the basic idea is predictably, after hearing us talk, is you acknowledge that I couldn't make you practice, and I just care too much about you to fight with you, to have one thing that we fight about all the time. And that, and you kind of say, I want you to think about music can be really great. You kind of make the case for it. But then if the kid doesn't want to practice, you say, what did you say? You take a couple months off from the lessons, and you can kind of see, do I miss it or not? Like that. And I mentioned in their first book that I'm pretty musical. My parents could tell. And and I wanted to play the accordion. There's a children's show that had the guy played the accordion. I'm like, God, that's the coolest thing. And I wanted to play the accordion. My parents said, well, we have a piano, and I want you to demonstrate that you're willing to practice regularly before we buy you an accordion. And I didn't really want to read music. So I took piano lessons for a couple of months. As a Christmas parent, my parents let me quit the piano lessons. And I'm eternally grateful to them, because when the Beatles came out, like so many people in my generation, I got into a band, and I still play in a rock and roll band at age 72. And I probably play and sing more than almost anybody I know who is forced to practice. And so, but the idea is that we want to let kids know, if they're open to hearing it, all the advantages of sticking with music. It's so good for your brain. It's so good for your development. But on the other hand, I don't want to fight with you constantly about anything. And so I think that also just mentioned that there's a story, there's a values. There's a story in the new book about this mom I consulted with, whose 13-year-old boy, an observant Jewish family, 13-year-old boy was refusing to have his bar mitzvah. And for an observant Jewish family, this is a pretty big deal. And he said, I feel like a hypocrite because I don't believe this stuff. And so the mom said, I kind of predict what you would say, but kind of talk me through it. And I said, no, just say, obviously, we couldn't make you do your bar mitzvah. I couldn't make you learn the Torah portion. I couldn't drag you up on the stage and have you, I couldn't make you do it. But I just want you to know that it's really important to your family. It's really important to your parents and to us. It's really important to your grandparents, your aunts and uncles. We all want to welcome you to the Jewish community. And I have huge respect for your integrity and not wanting to feel like a hypocrite. But I'm not asking you to buy it, any philosophy or religious history or whatever. But I do think it's really important to your family. I trust you to make a decision. And the kid said a couple of days later, okay, I'll do it. And he negotiated about how many people are coming and this and that. But he is bar mitzvah. And I think that trying to force values down kids' throats doesn't go very well.
One part of those, if we go back to self-determination theory, it's competency, relatedness, and autonomy. And when things get forced on kids, they end up having to choose between the relatedness or the autonomy, right? They'll sacrifice the autonomy because they want to get along with their parents. They want to feel approved of, or they put a stake in the ground and say, you can't make me do it, knowing that they may risk, whether it's true or not, they may be risking that relatedness in order to maintain their autonomy. And so, so with all these things, I mean, I love the way you described that, Bill, that, in many ways, from my perspective, talking about families, these are things important to us and we'd love to share them with you. But if you don't want to, I mean, my wife and I love to hike, and my daughter did it for a while. And then she said, I just don't want to do it. I don't want to walk up that darn mountain. It's like, okay, I can't, you're way too big for me to carry. I used to carry, I can't do that. I'm sure not going to drag you up there. And because that wouldn't be fun for either of us. And so she did it for a while and then she stopped. Much like Bill and the piano. But you came back to it.
Coming close to time. Quick question. I mean, it's been a little while since I've read the books. Obviously you're focused on talking about, sort of parent relationships and conversations. I just wonder, in your research, have you come across just sort of like the importance of, mentors, for kids who are not their parents, and sort of the role that people, are there conversations that are better done by sort of other sort of adult, role models in their lives?
Completely. Yeah. If you look at the research on kids who raised in adversity, who turn out well, these really ultra resilient kids, and you listen to their stories, what got you through this? It's so often a teacher or somebody who simply says, I like you and I have confidence in you. And I think that the educator's power is so. There's a story in the book about one of the focus groups. This kid said, "There's a teacher at our school, and I don't even have her for class, but I go into her room during lunch, and a bunch of kids do, because she listens to us carefully. She doesn't judge us, and she doesn't tell us what to do." And so I certainly the work on mentoring is very powerful, and I think you folks have a very important role to play. And my own kid, I have two kids. My son, when he was in high school, he confided me about some things, but not everything. But I said, "You got somebody you can talk about this?" He said, "I talk about with my coach or my uncle or something." And as long as they have somebody, that I was completely cool with that.
I had a client 25 years ago, and she herself was a psychologist, and it's long before I had kids. And she said, "You won't understand until you have kids of your own how useful it is to have another adult whom you can trust, who your kid connects with, who you can give your kid advice and who can look out for your kid, and you don't have to worry about it because this is another caring adult who has your kid's best interest in mind." And she was right. It wasn't until my kids are now at the age that they are that I've really come to appreciate that. And I think it's helpful to remind parents of that they don't have to teach their kid everything. They don't have to have every conversation about, sex and religion and, conflict and everything, because there are so many other folks out there in the world who can convey those messages. And I have the exact same experience that Bill has. My daughter will talk to me about a bunch of things, but, my wife will say, "Oh, Matthew asked about this and Katie asked about that." I'm like, fascinating. We've never had that conversation. And they pick and choose who they want to go to for information. And, it's just, it's nice. It's one of the reasons why one of the great things about being an educator, when you get to work with young people, is you oftentimes get a chance to fill in those gaps and let mom and dad be mom and dad, and you talk about, something else with them.
Excellent. Well, I'm noticing it's close to 8 o'clock, Ned. I know you need to jump off. Do you guys want to plug your book at all before we before we go? If you don't have it, where should they go get it?
Yeah, I mean, we support local independent bookstores. If you have one near you, we think that's always. I'm sure that Bezos guy would be happy to send one on a truck to you, but he probably has enough money. So we support those local independent bookstores because we like to keep them around. We wrote this book in part for parents. There can be few things are more frustrating or kind of discouraging than seeing your kid struggling, having a hard time, and wanting like the Dickens to help, and thinking that you have some really, helpful words to say, and then have the parent like, you just don't understand, and then they get upset with you, and then you're upset with them because they're upset with you, and everyone's kind of at cross purposes when everyone's, well-intentioned. And kind of one of the through lines in the book is it's not so much the what, but the how. This is not a book about how to talk about race or how to talk about sex or what values you should convey to your kid, but really, if you want to have productive conversations, here's kind of how to do this. So it's much more of a kind of content agnostic how-to manual, so that we can simply be effective in talking with our kids, one, helping them when they need help, and conveying values when we're trying to have those conversations about what's important to them and to us.
And I'll just add that the title of the book is What Do You Say? Talking with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bill, and that is wonderful. And we'll be sending out an email follow up from this with the video recording and a bunch of resources and things that were mentioned in the chat there. So you probably see that in your inbox tomorrow or the next day. So thank you all very much.
Thanks
Keep
for having
faith,
us,
folks.
Yeah,
Thanks for the work you do.
Yeah. Bye-bye. And if anybody has any last little questions or would like some follow-up information, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll grab it.